Piotr, can you introduce yourself to the group?
Hi, my name is Piotr Czarnas. I was working in IT for over 20 years. I actually started my career 20 years ago, or I think 22 years ago, in a startup. The startup actually broke, was bankrupt the day after the whole IT market in the year 2000 collapsed in US. Then I worked actually in Roche, building a software development team. When I left, I was managing a team of 120 developers because my heart was still in startups. When I started my job as a startup employee, I just wanted to create my own. So I created one company in the past. The company was finally renamed and moved to US. It's Liftron. It's a data management application for building data warehouses. And now I moved to a new space that is quite popular recently. That's something called data observability. This is the area where we just observe the data quality in databases just to see if the data is correct.
Great. Now, interestingly, the product you're building in this latest startup is also has an open source component. And so I wanted to ask you about this here. So why are you investing your money in software that you are going to release as open source? Are you crazy?
Well, actually, I'm observing the open source and the software market for a long time, and there is not much difference in terms of company size, popularity, or turnover between those companies that release their products as open source and those companies that release products as closed source. Well, open source companies have it's much easier to gain leads, to attract new customers, especially those customers who are afraid to start using a product with by calling a sales rep and asking for a demo version. In fact, my product is in the data management space. It's a data quality tool for people specializing in data analytics, business databases, data warehouses. And if you look at it, and actually you have experience in DevOps, that's your main area of expertise, even if somebody takes a product that is open source, they need to spend their time on setting up their environment, building their servers. Every product has a database somewhere behind a web server. You have to secure it, and of course pay for the environment. And it will anyway cost you 2 or 3 months of work for a good DevOps engineer. And actually, that's the cost of this 3 months of DevOps engineer is actually comparable to the cost of most database or B2B enterprise products. It's the entry price around $10,000 or $20,000, because that's sometimes the cost of the team that would install an open source tool in a private environment.
I got it. So the business model is that you're charging, or your other companies that work in that model charge for support, for setting up software, right? For responding to any tickets, support tickets.
Exactly.
Yeah. Got it.
Customers just want to be sure that somebody will reply to their issues, somebody will solve their problems. If you look at the market recently, nobody wants to repeat the same issue with Log4j. a very popular log framework that was used in, I think, millions of applications. And there was a bug, a very serious bug. When the bug was found, actually, there was only one developer working on the solution. And he said that he's actually working full-time, has a full-time job, and maybe tomorrow he'll find some time if his boss lets him spend some time on his old open source project. That's something nobody wants to hear.
Yeah. Log4j was a big one. I remember that myself. I mean, so it's still kind of ongoing for many companies. So yes, I totally get it. So let me, however, ask you a bit more about it. So you're charging for support, but if the software is released as open source, then clients can go to one of many different companies that provide support for that piece of software, not just to the initiator of the project. Maybe at the beginning, the initiator is the only one providing support, but if it becomes a mature product, you can purchase support from other companies as well for a large open source project. So what is the advantage of the initiator of the project to release the software as open source, given that they will lose the monopoly on providing support?
Well, if you look at the majority of open source projects, it takes a lot of time to train or somebody to know the details of the solution or just the internals. I was in the past contributing into Apache Spark, and well, we were using Apache Spark internally in our solution. I had the source code of Apache Spark open on my computer for like 2 years. I was reading every post on the internal community group. And what I noticed is that only a small group of developers actually working for Databricks, those guys who actually created the initial version and they founded Databricks, they were the only people who knew the project good enough that they could make heavy changes. All the rest of the community were just people who were working not inside the core project, they were just working around the project. They were creating some connectors, maybe some samples. But if you have a real problem, you have to go to the people who worked on the solution from day one.
Interesting. Yes. So that explains to some extent why companies that produce open source software, that initiate open source software, get sold for a lot of money. This could be this talent they have. Just to give you a few examples, so Red Hat purchased Cygnus in 1999 for over $674 million. And then IBM purchased Red Hat in 2019 for $34 billion. So that's a lot of money for a company that essentially has all of its software available as open source. So, so let me just ask the question, but you kind of have already asked it, answered it. But the question is, why would someone pay so much money for a company, that produced open source software, if anyone could just take that software, copy it, fork it, and just develop it further on its own, provide support on its own without actually just buying the company that made it in the first place?
Well, there is an interesting saying which says, if you want to go bankrupt in IT, just open source your 100 most important lines of code. But if you want to make somebody else go bankrupt, then open source everything. So essentially, whoever forks the solution, they don't have all those developers who worked on the solution from day one. And those big vendors actually acquire those open source platforms for a reason, because open source is quite easy. Well, many customers will just pick it, will prefer it. And companies like IBM will buy those smaller vendors just to get direct access to some customers that they never approached. Maybe a customer never considered IBM products, but now it's IBM Red Hat or IBM something. It changes everything. They can assign those customers to their own sales reps and do some upselling.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So let's imagine that you're advising someone who, a leader at a company that is considering open sourcing their products. And one of the first questions they may have is, what license should I choose? What would be your advice?
Well, let's say I was reviewing the list of open source licenses before I decided to pick one. I think that my decision was influenced mostly by one article that counted the size of investment from investors based on the license model that they selected. And the license that that were chosen by the majority of investors, so they invested their money, is Apache license, which is quite permissive, but it still leaves the owner, the original owner, some rights. Well, there is one particular sentence in this license which says, if you format my code, then you are obliged to put comments in the code to describe why you made every change. I believe I was not digging this idea, but looking at the market and those situations when somebody created the first version of an open source solution and somebody is using a clone, well, whoever cloned your solution will have to put a lot of documentation into their fork just to make sure that if there is a bug in their version of the code and the customer comes back to the original authors and tells them there is a bug, they can say, no, it's not our bug, and it's documented in the fork. There are also other licenses which should not be even considered for open source if you intend to use this solution in production or just sell it to customers or just sell support. There are some licenses like GNU, which say, well, if you put a piece of this code somewhere, you have to make everything GNU license and open source. But both Apache license and also MIT license say that you can actually use this product instead of your solution. But you only are required to like mention the original license, put some comments why you make the changes.
Okay, interesting. So you're advising against the GNU license, which is quite popular. And Linux is covered by GNU GPL 2.0. So can you just maybe elaborate on this a little bit more? So this particular feature of GPL is some consider it an advantage, right? That it can the software cannot be directly sort of compiled into proprietary code.
Okay, so just look at the biggest vendors on the market that are famous for their open source solutions. For example, Databricks, that is behind Apache Spark. They have well, a lot of customers. Their customers are paying a lot of money. That's a very healthy business. They use Apache license because it doesn't mean that any other code related to your solution must be also open source. So in open source, if you want to make a company on that, you have to decide which part of the code is so common that there is no competitive advantage in having a closed source solution. You just can open source it because there are already similar open source solutions on the market. But some part of the code, especially the code that is running in the cloud, should be closed source. You cannot be forced to open source all your DevOps scripts, all your configuration scripts that we are using to make your cloud version of the application. Because that is when you will actually lose the business.
Okay, interesting.
That's why it works in Linux, because Linux, there is no custom vendor in Linux that is selling you Linux in the cloud. Everything is open source. Whatever is in Linux, it has the same license. It's fully open source. There is no benefit in there, but the business model is different. Those companies like Red Hat will charge you for support, for help, for providing patches ahead of time, for helping you install those patches, but they don't have any proprietary code in the cloud. And will be infected by a GNU license.
All right, so let's then move on to the technical infrastructure. So if you're starting an open source project, what sort of technical infrastructure do you need to support it?
Well, starting an open source project is a little easier because many platforms like GitHub offer free licenses. You can get free licenses from JetBrains or development tools. You can get free licenses for some development servers, build servers. You can already start having a lot of environments just because you are open source.
Okay, got it. Now, when it comes to governance, and that's an interesting one. So as a business that invests in open source, you will sooner or later get contributors from other organizations. Obviously, that's one of the goals. So how do you govern such a project? How do you make sure the others do not feel that they are outside of the community? How do you make decisions in such a community of people from different organizations? What's your advice?
My advice, sharing whatever information you have, build groups, share the development goals, the community, and of course the new community members, the new contributors, they will not know the whole project. They will not be able to make changes in the core of the solution. But if you look at a lot of vendors, especially those with a huge community, they just separated the project into areas where it's much easier to develop or contribute some code, like connectors, like some connectors, some APIs, add-ins, plugins. that's the place where the community members will work on it. It will also be quite important for other vendors to contribute some code in your solution because they just want to connect their platforms to your platform.
Okay, got it.
In terms of governance, the new contributors need just an area when they can easily add new features. They will see those features available pretty quickly, available for anybody. And you can just notice those contributors that are already giving you hints about the core of the product. And you can give them additional features to develop in the core of the product. Of course, first doing a code review, and maybe later they could become regular developers. Maybe you'll hire them.
Okay, so that's interesting because in that model, the company that initiated the project still has a leading role. You still expect that this company will lead all the core development. The rest of the community will develop plugins, etc. Now, some projects have moved towards creating some sort of foundation behind the project, like the OpenStack Foundation, which later turned into Open Infrastructure Foundation, so that so to say, core governance is moved to a more neutral organization.
Yeah.
Do you see what's your thinking on this? Do you see a role for such a neutral organization in the governance process?
It makes sense for a big project that has a lot of integrations because individual contributors will not have time to play in the governance, to review some documents, prepare for some meetings, do some work that is scheduled, that must be delivered on time. Only those contributors who work for some other companies that depend on your open source platform, will have time to spend to promote this community. So that the product must be big enough that some other vendors cannot stop investing their time in contributing. So usually those foundations have some sponsors from other companies.
Okay,
those
got
companies
it.
actually make money, so they can afford to help.
Got it. All right, so I'm going to switch the view now to gallery and invite everyone to contribute. Give me 1 second. I'm going to do this right now. We have a question from Matti. By the way, good to see you again, Matti. It's good to see someone who joins these meetups frequently. The question is about speed of development. So did open sourcing make your workflows slower?
I don't think so. Not unless I would have a dependency on external contributors who are in the core team. But it takes a lot of time to gain those contributors who can work on the same features as the rest of the team. So I wouldn't see too much change here.
Got it. Got it. Interesting. Yeah. So this is, in a sense, a function of this decision or not really so much a decision, just a realization of the fact that at the beginning, the core team is really just within this one organization, the one that initiated the project. And for the time being, that's probably going to remain that way. So I have a question about funding. So how do you fund those activities? And that includes programming and non-programming. I assume, if it's in this model, there's a company that is intended to make money on it, right? So that's an obvious source of funding. Well, but can you just give us some overview of this? What would be the your advice on how to get funding for such a project?
Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. If you look at the majority of the market, when you have a product, you need to have some customers, non-related customers, to attract venture capital funding. So somebody will give you enough money to work on that. The other option is just to grow using your own money, like I'm doing. But I'm in a, let's say, privileged position where I'm actually running a software company where we developed a quite similar solution as a closed code solution for a very big vendor, for a very big company. And actually, my team is working on those on very similar features. That gives me enough budget just to keep those developers who are actually waiting between assignments. Maybe there is just a delay in their work stream, which they can just contribute to building something similar as an open source solution. So the technology, the idea, the platform is very similar. So there is not much learning curve for developers to switch from a similar closed source solution and a similar open source solution.
Got it. That brings me to another question, and that's about hiring. Have you found any difference there between hiring for a proprietary project and hiring for an open source project, for hiring developers that would work on such a project?
Personally, I think, well, we haven't seen any, since we released the product on open source, we haven't done too much recruitation, but I believe that it should be easier just to pick those developers who will not tell us that the technology they are working on is not interesting for them. In IT, you will notice that I think 30% of developers who start their job position will leave it within a year, only because the job offer said I will be working in, let's say, Java, and they are hired, and instead of Java, they are actually moved to front-end, and they have to learn some front-end frameworks. Why? Because they cannot review the source code on which they will be working ahead of time. If the source code is in Git, the candidates can just review if that's the technology stack they want to work, and at least I can avoid the risk of hiring those people who will leave.
Got it. Yeah, that's definitely an advantage to candidates. So let me ask you also about open source quality. So I found that many open source projects, especially the ones started by volunteers, are often unfinished and kind of unpolished. It may be really good at the core, but it's missing sometimes the final touch, maybe the boring stuff that needs to be done to really bring it to completion. So what are your thoughts about this? I call it the last mile problem of open source. How do you solve this problem? Is that something you would charge for a fancy GUI maybe, or some installer or some stuff that is missing from the core feature, some extensions to it? Is that something to make money on using proprietary software?
Well, have you seen the quality of the code that is not open source? Especially the quality of applications that are developed for IT projects, when the customer just hires a bunch of developers and wants to develop a solution. So the majority of open source projects are a little better, because if you would release a code that is of very low quality, then people will point you out with their fingers.
Yes, exactly.
So
I think I've heard this phrase that developers write software differently when they know that the entire world will be watching.
Yes, I did once. I downloaded an application when I was running a different company. I downloaded the application of the biggest competitor, the biggest platform on the market. I used some hacky tools to decompile the code, and I was surprised that the platform company had like 500 employees. They were on the market for 15 years. They had big millions of dollars in revenue, annual revenue, just to support 500 people on board. They didn't have any venture capital investment, so actually they had to make a lot of money. And I looked into the code and I was shocked, because the whole platform was written in the main function.
And you sure it's not? It wasn't so some problem with the decompiling tools?
You at least see that there are some classes extracted. But if you see that the compiler shows you that the main class is just a long list of switch and if statements, then you will see that, well, that's not a coincidence.
Interesting. Right, and that's a very good point. Yes, so proprietary software, we don't really, users don't really know what's in there, you know, what's the quality of it, and that's absolutely true. My question was not so much about the code, and I think I fully agree with you about the code part. It was more about the fancy stuff that users like, which is, you know, fancy icons, or just you know, a simple automated installer and things like that. Maybe a demo at the beginning of when you start the application, if it's a GUI application, maybe a demo, a walkthrough, a tutorial, documentation, etc. All of that stuff. I find it to be, you know, frequently missing in many open source projects, and that is a pain point. And I think if you're you know, a business behind it, you can obviously provide this, but would you recommend giving that away for free as well? Or would you recommend having that as a sort of paid add-on to this software?
This could be either a paid add-on, or if you know that this application is a typical enterprise application for B2B customers, with a price point in at least $5,000-$10,000 a year, you can just afford to add a couple of those fancy tools like installers. Because anyway, those customers will just download those installers, but they will either need some servers. So here the economy of scale works. They can buy and set up their own server, or they can just use a SaaS version.
Yeah.
So the fancy installer will be there for you as a kind of like lead generation tool, or just a way to attract the customers, to give an easy way for those customers to play with the tool for the first time.
Got it. Yeah, makes sense. Now, my next question is, how do you grow the community of developers? How do you attract them to contribute to the code? Perhaps initially just by submitting bug reports, then maybe by doing some simple development, bug fixing of some kind, and then maybe eventually creating a plugin, like you mentioned. How do you attract people to that?
Well, the biggest communities that I see around products that are even quite early, that are quite young, are those that have some kind of connectivity or extensibility points. Just look at products like Terraform. It has hundreds of connectors. So the idea is that you provide some easy to use template, how to create your own connector extension plugin.
Got it.
And people just fork it. They create their own repositories. They are their own masters. And they are working on those platforms on their own.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay. Now, I'd like to also ask you a little bit about the trends. What do you think are the trends in the industry, especially with regards to open source? Do you think that this business model around open source has become more sort of palatable, acceptable to investors, or maybe not so? Investors and users and corporate users, what's your thinking about that?
Well, let's say it's not. Well, investors are, well, if they see that there are customers willing to pay for a support or cloud version of an open source solution, they will buy it. They will invest in that. If you look at the trends, well, those open source platforms that have an idea how to run them in the cloud actually are very successful. It's an interesting point if you look at Docker.
Yes.
Docker had a lot of issues because they created a platform that was very attractive for users, but it didn't have any component inside that those users would want to use a SaaS version. If the company behind Docker would release their own maybe Kubernetes servers in the cloud, letting people to deploy their containers in the cloud, they would probably be far more successful or profitable. But they had a lot of issues just making any money from the solution.
Yes, it's an interesting case because the technologies are very successful, but the company has not been very commercially successful, even though they were, part of well-known accelerators and so on. And I think they have tried various business models as well. So yeah, it's an interesting case there. That they didn't find a good business model, but maybe now they're on the right track. Yeah. What do you think would be your advice when it comes to adapting to such a change? Or maybe let me ask it differently. Do you think there's anything else that has changed in this industry that affects this audience? I'm talking about leaders who are perhaps considering open sourcing their products. Something to keep in mind, something that has changed perhaps in the legal framework to keep in mind.
So what I can notice already talking with some potential customers is that many companies prefer open source tools, which is interesting, to manage or access highly sensitive data.
Makes sense.
Maybe 20 years ago, maybe somebody would say, how would you use some open source tool to access your mostly critical data? But actually, many customers consider that an open source tool will be reviewed by the community good enough, but it's more secure than a closed source solution.
Yeah.
And of course, even if such a customer wants to run this platform in-house, they will definitely need help from the authors of the solution to secure it correctly, to install it correctly in their environment.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so we are nearing the end of this part. I will stop the recording soon, and we're going to have an informal chat for the last 10 minutes or so. But before I do that, I wanted to ask you if there's anything else I haven't asked you about that you would like to share with the audience.
So you didn't ask me actually what kind of product we released as open source. So we released a so-called data observability tool. It's a framework for analyzing the quality of data in databases. We are, well, my team has, as I said previously, we worked on a similar solution for one of big vendors, one of companies that is the first, second, maybe third, but not further, biggest spender on advertisement. They spend huge billions of dollars on ads. So if you turn on the TV, you will see their ad for sure. And we have built about 800 custom data quality checks just to see and monitor the quality of data received from various vendors, analyze marketing data. So what we created, we just created an open source tool where we selected the most important quality checks out of those 800 that we developed. So just to do some, if I can mention some, if I can just advertise my solution, we analyze the timeliness of data. So just monitor if the data is there in the database, the completeness of data. If you, for example, have the data for every single day of the week or month, or the consistency of data. So how the data behaves. Is the number of rows growing? Because you cannot, well, if the number of customers in the customer table drops, that's something wrong.
Yeah, that makes sense. So to follow up from the discussion we had, these data quality checks would be the plugins that the community could potentially contribute.
Exactly. So that's the place where we divided the application, that there are 3 areas where if you look at the platform, where there is a place for open source, which is the core engine that you run locally. There is the place for extensibility for the community to create new connectors, new data quality checks, maybe implement some kind of quality checks, maybe business specific, maybe data quality checks specific to ERP platforms, where people can just contribute and put their quality checks that can analyze the data maybe in SAP.
Yeah.
And the third area is our closed source platform, just the scripts, how to host that platform in the cloud.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so the product you're selling is, so can you explain that maybe in your own words? So the software itself is available in open source, and what is it that clients are paying for? Well,
of course, they are paying for support. We will be happy to help them as we are working with our biggest customer on implementing and designing custom data quality checks. Right now, it's actually 13 people working full-time for just one customer. That's how many quality checks you can develop for a big. So I'm betting that many of actually open source platforms are actually software houses who provide software development services for the customers. And their open source solution is just a way to get into the customer. And that's the biggest area.
Makes sense.